So hello, everyone, and welcome. This is our panel on the public funding of journalism, interesting models and policies. So often we focus on the symptoms of our civic decline, the latest crazy thing happening in politics that is disappointing us. But it's not enough to just deal with the symptoms. There has fortunately been a turn towards looking at the foundations of our civic decline. Henry David Thoreau once said, "There are thousands striking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." And one of the key foundations to our democracy is thriving local journalism. I see three reasons for this, but our panelists are going to get into it with a lot more nuance and insight. But you need to know what's happening to engage in politics. You need an entity that's watchdogging the government and the political system outside of the political system itself. And local journalism is also something that coheres local communities, makes people feel part of something. And the market right now is not sustaining local journalism. There's been a huge collapse. And so people are turning to public funding as an option for supporting rejuvenating local journalism ecosystems. It is a new, old idea in American history. Today, here we have a panel with two people advocating for public support for local journalism, Mark Histed and Katie Wilson. Mark is the author of the Democracy Policy Network's policy kit on a new idea called news dollars, a promising idea for public funding. And he has been advocating for it across the country while engaging with the broader public funding of journalism movement. Katie Wilson is the general secretary of the Transit Riders Union, a Seattle-based organization advocating for improved public transit and other progressive urban issues. She is currently part of the team leading the effort to get news dollars implemented in Seattle. So to kick this off, Mark, why don't we start with you? Kick us off here. Tell us a little bit how you got into this issue, why you care so much about it, and what this news dollars idea is.
Yes, thank you, Pete, and thank you for the great introduction. I just want to welcome, I'm really happy to be here with this whole community of advocates and policy thinkers and legislators. This is like the core kind of energy we want in order to, drive progress across the country. It's really great. I'll just give a few minutes of introduction here. We're in the middle of a journalism crisis in America. We have seen the collapse, really, it's fair to say, the collapse of local news across the country. And I just want to say to what Pete said about that great quote from Thoreau, I think we have an issue here that is of central import to everything that this community, we all here together care about. I can paraphrase as well Nick Johnson, a well-known ex-FCC commissioner who said, no matter what your major issue of concern is, no matter what the policy issue is that you care about, your second issue should be journalism and media, because it is difficult to get any policy done without voters in a democracy having good access to information. And we are facing a situation here where increasingly voters across the nation do not have access to good information. We are seeing a case where local newspapers are being purchased by private equity or Wall Street firms and closed down. We've seen over the past 20 years a massive loss of journalism jobs. And as Pete says, this is leading to a weakening of community bonds and really a nationalization of politics. As local news has collapsed, what's filled the void? Nationalized cable news, right? And people turning to central news sources for this kind of thing. And this is why it's super important for us to think about this issue. So what is the root issue? Why is journalism, local news across the country collapsing? And it's simple. It's because journalism is really a public good in the economic sense. Before 25 years ago, we had a very robust in many ways, a very robust local news environment in the U.S. And that led to in many newspapers across the country that serve cities and localities. In some cases, we had cities with multiple newspapers. What supported those newspapers? We made a choice in the US to support those newspapers with advertising. And the newspapers across the country were funded via local classified ad monopolies. We allowed newspapers to have a monopoly on local classified advertising, and that is what allowed them to thrive. And that brought enormous amounts of money into journalism. But the rise of the digital age, first Craigslist and then Google and Facebook, blew up those local classified ad monopolies. And now we're in a case where we are turning to consumer markets to support journalism. And journalism is very much a public good in the sense that what consumers are willing to pay for it is not the what it is worth to democracy. And so we have public goods of all sorts in our society. We have things like roads and firefighting, and those things are paid for public goods like that, where consumers will not, consumer markets will not support them. We pay for those with tax dollars, with public dollars. And this is something that we should consider doing with journalism as well. And what we're talking about here today is a proposal to subsidize journalism with public dollars, treat it as a public good via news notes or news coupons, where individuals in a locality receive a coupon from the government, and individuals decide which news outlets should get the money, should get those by giving coupons to the news outlet, and the news outlets redeem the coupons to the government, redeem them for money from the government to subsidize the journalism. This is the proposal we're discussing today. Pete?
Thank you, Mark. We will get more into the details of this idea of news dollars, where basically the way to fund journalism, just to state again for those who didn't pick up, is instead of the government specifically picking people to fund, like entities to fund, journalistic entities to fund, they give the funds to the people to fund journalistic entities. So it's a way to have public funding, but also have individual choice over where that funding goes. And we'll get into all the nuances and details later on. But let's kick it over to Katie. Katie, could you talk a little bit, first off, it'd be great to learn just a little bit about what the Transit Riders Union is and why you saw public funding of journalism as part of this cause, what you're planning to do with this campaign that has recently launched, and what you've seen so far in your work on the ground advocating for this cause.
Sure. And yeah, it's great to be here. And it's possible that I will be interrupted by a baby who now hears my voice from the other room. So hopefully we won't have too many interruptions. But so I work with an organization called the Transit Riders Union, which was founded about a dozen years ago, originally focusing on fighting for better and more affordable public transit. We've since kind of diversified, so we work on all kinds of issues, everything from affordable housing to renter protections to labor standards. We've run a couple of minimum wage campaigns here in King County. I suppose everything that we work on is kind of loosely tied together under the kind of economic justice, I suppose, would be the common theme. And in the course of that work, as I think Pete and Mark both mentioned, if you care about something, you need eyes on it in order to make progress. And so having a strong local media ecosystem is essential to the work that we do, because we need newspapers who are covering the issues that we're working on, that are keeping an eye on City Hall, that are keeping an eye on the many large corporations that have made Seattle their home. And when we don't have those eyes, we miss things, and it becomes hard to fight for the policies that we want to see. I've also do some occasional writing myself for local publications as a columnist. So I've also kind of had a front row seat there to some of the struggles of our local news outlets. I would say that Seattle, compared to the rest of Washington State, even compared to the rest of King County, is doing comparatively well in terms of having a number of local news outlets, but is not at all immune to this problem. So we used to have two daily newspapers, the Seattle Times and the Post-Intelligencer. Now we're down to one. We used to have two alternative weeklies that had, weekly print editions. Now we're down to one. There's a number of small online publications that have been trying to kind of fill in the gaps or have more kind of niche focuses, and they're just constantly struggling to like pay a reporter, right? And so I think the struggle is real, and we're definitely have seen in Seattle how the decline of our local news ecosystem means that it's, there's just not, like, if you're a activist or an organization trying to get an op-ed placed on your issue, there's just not that many options for places that are going to take your op-ed. So your options for really getting the word out to voters, to residents are limited. And more people are getting their news in sound bites from social media, and are stuck in their political echo chambers and not reading the same things as their neighbors. So seeing this problem, I actually heard about this idea that Mark and the Democracy Policy Network have developed some years ago. And I think, Seattle's an interesting place to think about this model of funding local news, because we have a program called Democracy Vouchers, which was passed by voters in 2015, I believe. And it's basically a public funding system for local elections. It doesn't replace private funding, but basically there's a pot of public money, which is funded by a small property tax levy. And Seattle voters have a chance in every local election cycle to allocate about $100 in four $25 vouchers to the candidates of their choice. And candidates have to do certain things to become eligible to participate in the program. But it basically enables people who might ordinarily not have the money to donate to political candidates to help to fund their campaigns. And so the idea was to try to shift political power toward the people and away from the wealthy and corporate interests that might normally be making large expenditures in political campaigns. And so I think what's interesting there is that we have experience with this kind of mechanism of having individuals allocate a small amount of public funding. And so what we're looking at with a news dollars or news coupons or news notes, however you choose to describe it, program, is a similar mechanism where there would be a stream of public funding, and instead of giving your notes or your coupons or your vouchers to your favorite political candidate for city council or mayor, you would be giving it to your favorite local news outlets. And so what we've been doing over the past year and a half or so is beginning to build kind of a coalition around this here in the Seattle area. And we are hoping to run a citizens initiative next year to put a program like this on the ballot. We were originally hoping to do it this year, but we weren't able to raise the funds that we need to run the campaign. But we are continuing to try, and also recognizing that this is a problem, obviously not just in Seattle, but around the state. We're also beginning to talk to state legislators and trying to get a bill along similar lines for a statewide program introduced in the legislative session next year. Bills often take multiple years, as I'm sure many of you know, to go anywhere, but to really get the conversation rolling about what a statewide program that could support struggling newspapers around the state could look like. So that's kind of where we are at. And maybe I'll pause there, and Mark, if you want to add anything, or you think there's anything else that I should talk about at this point.
I'll jump in quickly and say a few things. First, just on a logistics level, anyone in the audience, if you have a question, drop it in the chat. We're going to slowly transition to me asking questions after these opening statements and incorporating your questions. One thing that we were really drawn to about this idea at Deepen was that, we've also have a kit on democracy vouchers and spreading the Seattle model of public finance. What we loved about the democracy vouchers idea, which was this kind of system where everyone got $100 to donate to a candidate, is it solved two things at once. One, if you simply had a matching funds system for a candidate, or you gave every candidate a lump sum, you may be able to hack away at the problem of, corporate or wealthy control of candidates, because suddenly you're equalizing money on the candidate level. But you never involve the voters themselves in the campaign finance system. What was so great about the democracy voucher system is in equalizing the fight against big money, you're also giving every citizen this opportunity to have an active civic engagement, opening up the campaign finance system to more people in more ways. And what we liked about this, which is, it's really good to, have grants and have, direct subsidies to journalism outlets. But what this does is it also invites every citizen to enter into a relationship with a journalism outlet by having the voucher themselves. And so we were really excited about that. Mark, do you want to, maybe Mark, you can also talk about how there's other bills around the country around the same model. It also might be interesting to our audience about what are some other ways people have thought about subsidizing or publicly funding local journalism, what the upsides and downsides are of each, and why you're drawn to this model.
Yeah, that sounds great. I will start, maybe we can start by talking about other kinds of bills that are happening right now, and specifically focused on the District of Columbia, which should be a state, so hopefully soon to be a state. DC has a quite large budget, and it has a council that functions in some ways, in many ways like a legislature. In the past year, we have been very excited to see that a council member, a legislator from DC, introduced a really excellent bill to implement this news dollars idea to fund local news in the District of Columbia with public dollars. And that council member is Janice Lewis-George. She has really been a visionary on this issue on trying to save and really restore the kind of local news coverage in DC or the kind of local news that we've been talking about. DC has not been exempt from the crisis of local news that's sweeping the country, even though there are many national publications based in DC and many, many journalists who live in DC. The amount of actual local news coverage, the local news industry covering DC itself has also been under significant stress. And so, this bill is something that we at DPN are very excited about, and we are hoping that this, makes some progress in the next year. And in terms of different kinds of models that could be developed or different kinds of approaches that people are taking, of course, this kind of the challenges that we face with the decline of local news across the country, there have been many kinds of approaches taken. There have been some philanthropic approaches, people trying to direct money to local news outlets. One challenge with that is that philanthropy tends to want to just fund, to just deliver seed funding to develop a new business model, but not develop sustaining funding that can support local news for many years. And often philanthropy has a tendency to change their focus, on the every few years. And so you don't want to get into a situation where you're supporting a local news outlet with philanthropic dollars, and then the outlet decides to change its direction. The other kind of approaches are policy approaches. There are tax credit bills in play. New York City has directed government city advertising to local news outlets in DC. But the kind of recurring concern that we're seeing here is that, and the kind of concern that I share is that that it's not a good idea to allow governments and politicians to be making direct decisions about which news outlets to receive money. We want our journalism to be independent of politics. We want it to be independent of government. And so this kind of voucher or news coupon approach that we're talking about here, instead of putting decisions on which outlets to fund in the hands of the governments, it puts the decisions in the hands of people, of individuals, of citizens. And that's the kind of model that we want here.
Mark, one more. I want, Katie, do you have something you want to share on that?
Well, I was just going to jump in. I think, I know that at least one of the bills that's in play in California is a kind of jobs tax credit based bill, so that basically like news outlets would be getting funding based on kind of journalism jobs that they're sustaining. And I don't think that's a bad idea at all, but I think that just thinking about the kind of media landscape in Seattle, there's a lot of, these kind of quite small online news outlets that are doing really great reporting, but they might be like mostly volunteer run, or they might have like, half an FTE or like one FTE, and be relying on, freelancers and voluntary writers. And you really want to support that part of the ecosystem as well, and allow those outlets to grow and hopefully hire journalists. And so if you're only doing this through kind of a jobs tax credit, then you're really failing to support those kind of startups and smaller outlets.
Katie, one question, as you have been advocating on the ground for this, and Mark, if you want to chime in as well, what is some of the pushback that you get, and how have you usually responded or thought about that pushback?
I guess there's kind of one level of concern about how are we preventing public money going to news outlets that are not kind of responsible actors in one way or another, right? And maybe aren't even like legitimate news outlets, right? Like Pink Slime, or like just websites that are using AI to generate articles, or just like pure political propaganda or something. And so, this is kind of, I think, a tricky area of kind of the policy development, is figuring out how to have kind of eligibility criteria for news outlets to participate in the program that are weeding out some of that, but at the same time, like remaining viewpoint neutral. And I don't think this is an insoluble problem at all, but it's just something that people bring up when they hear about the idea, wanting to make sure if it's public funding that it's going toward legitimate news coverage. There's another kind of policy question about how a program like this treats outlets that have kind of a subscription paywall model versus an open access model. And some advocates for this idea, Robert McChesney comes to mind, really like the idea of focusing on funding kind of nonprofit journalism, open access journalism, and excluding perhaps outlets that have a paywall. But then there's kind of a tension there, because especially newspapers with significant newsrooms, like they don't really have a way to survive right now, except for trying to build out an online subscription model. And a program like this would have to be pretty enormous and very, very well funded in order to be able to actually replace that subscription revenue. So you're putting kind of struggling newspapers in a tough spot if you're demanding that they jump through hoops and provide open access to their content in order to participate in a program like this. So there's kind of those kind of tricky questions about just what news outlets are able to participate. I think, here in Seattle, the Democracy Voucher Program is, I think, broadly popular and considered to be a success in enabling people who wouldn't normally participate in campaign donations to participate, and just kind of allowing candidates also who have full-time jobs and wouldn't normally be able to run. So I think there's a lot good to say about the program, but it also, some people here criticize the program for being, having high overhead costs, and, I think we had about maybe 10% of eligible voters participated in the program. And so people perceive that as kind of low participation. So there's been some concern about like, well, are people actually going to participate in this News Notes program? So you hear things like that, but I think I would say that broadly speaking, both the news outlets that we've talked to here and community organizations and civic organizations think that it's a great idea and we should do it. So I wouldn't want to overemphasize the naysayers or the concerns.
Mark, anything you want to add there? And I'll also note, Mark, in the News Dollars kit, gets into many of these nuances: paywall, not paywall, nonprofit, for-profit, and more. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, we have definitely in the Deepen kit covered a bunch of the different policy options and tried to summarize all the different kind of policy thinking that has been done on this issue in the past. And we are always available to answer questions. I should also say that we have talked to, Katie and her, the Save Seattle News Coalition has really done also a lot of hard policy thinking and thought through a lot of the issues that are in play. And so, I think looking to the bill that they've developed and the direction they are headed, I think they've, really thought about this very hard. I would just chime in to add to what Katie said, in terms of issues that come up when we talk about this, the question of eligibility and who's going to get the money here is something that comes up frequently. You hear a lot of, well, people are going to give the money to untrustworthy news outlets, and I think my answer to that is just that we already have a situation here today where mis and sort of disinformation, depending on the definition you'd like to use, has significant funding. I mean, there are certainly corporate and wealthy interests that are putting money into pink slime kind of news operations in order to change and manipulate public debate. And people say things like real news is behind a paywall while misinformation is free. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. What really, I think, in our view, what really needs to happen is an injection of public money into real journalism. Will lift all boats, right? Some money may well go into outlets that are peddling opinions that we may not like, but many of those outlets are already funded. And the issue is that real journalism and real news is not receiving money. This is something that we can change. And I would say I think that's the kind of major issue that we need to address at this point.
Feel free, anyone in the audience who wants to drop anything in the chat or a Q&A, we can make sure get your questions to Mark and Katie. Mark, one of the things you pointed out in the kit that was interesting is the historic and international precedents for this. So, you can look at this news dollar system or the idea of publicly funding journalism. This seems just like a kind of crazy idea that's off the dome that you all are just kind of proposing out of nowhere. But could you talk a little bit about the historic and international precedents for the public funding of journalism?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Thanks. Yeah, I think that we can compare, as Pete says, we can look both to U.S. history and to what's happening in other democracies today. So historically, the U.S. has subsidized journalism, and in fact, one of the earliest actions of the framers of the Constitution after the Constitution was passed was to pass a postal bill that effectively acted to subsidize journalism by giving it subsidized postage. Back in the day when newspapers were often delivered by the post. And that public subsidy has been estimated to be, by the middle of the 19th century, as high as $40 billion today. So there was a massive, massive public investment in subsidizing journalism. And there are newspapers, the abolitionist papers, for example, were distributed across the US via public subsidy. And you might imagine that many of the abolitionist papers in the mid 19th century would not have had the traction they had and not achieved the progress that they made without these kind of public subsidies. And beyond historical precedent, there's also, as Pete alludes to, precedent from looking at other democracies. And media scholars like Victor Pickard have written extensively about the kind of spending that other democracies give to support for journalism. And I think that, I don't remember the exact number offhand, but if we look at that, other peer democracies like the UK and Japan and the Nordic countries spend about 100 times more on public subsidies for journalism than the US spends. I think we're at about $1 per capita per year, and other countries are $130 per capita per year, $200 per capita per year. And so, other democracies have decided that journalism is a public good and it should be supported that way. And this is something that we can do too, and we can begin, at the state and local level.
Thanks, Mark. We're coming to the end. Katie, we have 2 questions that came in the Q&A. Are there any concerns about how this could change the practices or behavior of newsrooms? They start funding like political parties, trying to procure vouchers. And also if there's a distinction between kind of opinion and infotainment media and actual journalism coverage, as you're navigating that, putting together a campaign in Seattle for this, actually needing to write the bill or the initiative, how do you think about those questions?
Yeah, and I see another question up there too about how do we avoid public officials interfering with coverage paid for by taxpayers. On that first question, in our proposed legislation, and I believe also in the DC proposed legislation, there's an independent commission that would be created by the legislation where to kind of oversee the program, where the members of that commission or board would be kind of nominated by external institutions that have some expertise, relevant expertise. So like a journalism school or, the King County Bar Association, League of Women Voters, right? Something like that. And so the idea is to have some independent oversight of the program, and that body would be, to the extent that there is any judgment involved in determining outlet eligibility for the program, that would be done by this independent body as opposed to by a like employee of the city. So that's an attempt to add an extra layer of kind of like independence to the program. But I mean, the main thing is just that the actual decision to fund an outlet or not is being made by individual residents as opposed to the government. In terms of changing the practice or behavior of newsrooms, that actually is a concern that I've heard from a couple people in Seattle, because one of the things, I mean, like with our democracy voucher program, there's been a couple instances where a candidate has like their campaign has gone out and collected vouchers from people, maybe like misrepresenting what they're for, like, oh, do you want to solve homelessness? Here, sign over your voucher. So I think there's been a little bit of a concern that, yeah, maybe newsrooms will become very focused on collecting these vouchers, and they could like do things that are not really like about improving their news coverage in order to do that. So, I mean, I think one thing that's just important from a policy perspective is like, newspapers shouldn't be able to give you something of monetary value in exchange for your voucher, except perhaps maybe like a subscription or a trial subscription or something. So you shouldn't be able to like, a news outlet shouldn't be able to throw like the party of the year with like great music headliners or something like that, and then have your news vouchers be the price of admission, because then you're collecting vouchers for a reason that has nothing to do with the actual coverage that you're providing. So I think some things like that can kind of like help with that problem. I think we're also going to have a reporting requirement where outlets would have to report any funds that they spent on voucher collection. So like if a newsroom like wants to do something like beyond just say in their outlet like give us your vouchers, if they want to like actually have a staff person who's like devoted to collecting vouchers, they're going to at least need to report that they're spending that money, so that when people decide where to put their vouchers, they can see the extent to which their money is actually just going to go back into an endless cycle of voucher collection or something like that, as opposed to supporting news coverage.
Thanks. Thank you, Katie. We have about 1 minute, and I know Mark just has one final thing he wants to share.
Yeah, Katie, thanks for all that. I think you're putting your finger on like an independence issue that is super, super important. And thanks for working through the details. I think you guys have done some like great policy thinking around these questions, and really a model. I would just say on independence that I was speaking to a local news publisher recently, and what they said really resonated with me, and that is that the key, a really, really key value here is journalistic independence. We want accountability journalism. We want journalism to be able to report on power, right? We want them to be able to report on journalism, on governments, on corporate power, on all kinds of power in an effort to make to inform voters and make the democracy more informed. And the best way to do that is to diversify sources of funding, and that means funding from advertising is good, funding from subscriptions is good, funding from philanthropy is good, and adding to the mix public funding. What that does is actually improve independence, right? It allows journalism to be more independent of single sources of power. And I think it's really the kind of solution that can move us in that direction. I wonder if you agree, Mark. Thanks.
We've dropped Mark's info on his kit in the chat. Katie, how can people support your work in Seattle before we go?
I mean, yeah, if you know anyone who has like $1 million they want to throw at our campaign, like let me know. Yeah, I mean, we have a kind of a placeholder website, saveseattlenews.org, that we need to update. But yeah, we're hoping that fundraising allowing, we'll be able to launch an actual campaign next year. So I don't know, there's not a lot that, I mean, I don't know. Sign up on the website and we'll keep you in the loop.
Katie Wilson of the Transit Riders Union, Mark Histed, News Dollars expert for Democracy Policy Network. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.